I'm Bill Reisinger, ICFRC board member, and I'm part of the University of Iowa faculty, and I'll be hosting today's program. We thank our members, sponsors, volunteers, and interns for making these forums possible since the year when McDonald's first introduced McNuggets in 1983. And as always, we're very grateful to several key university and community sponsors: the UI International Programs, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, and the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization. I thank today's special sponsors, Taxes Plus, Conrad Schultz, and Mike Margolin. I also thank City Channel 4 for professionally recording our programs for cablecast on City Channel 4 or 118-2 and the U of I Library's digital archives. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Lynda Barrow. She is currently professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Coe College. She has been at Coe since 1999, teaching a variety of courses on comparative and international politics. She received her master's degree in Theological Studies from Wesley Theological Seminary, and then went on to get her Ph.D. from Syracuse University, where she completed dissertation research on Protestants and politics in Mexico. She still travels frequently to Mexico for research. She has also participated in several panels on ethical perspectives in the news with KCRG. In her free time, Professor Barrow is active in her church, as well as with Habitat for Humanity and the Alzheimer's Association. By the way, in connection with her volunteer flood relief work, she has said, "I swing a mean crowbar." So audience members, keep those questions polite. So today, Professor Barrow will talk with us about the resurgence of religion in the post-Cold War world. Please join me in welcoming Lynda Barrow.
Thanks, Bill, and thank you, all of you, for being here. It's a great pleasure and privilege to speak before you today. I love the trivia questions. By the way, I have never gone deep cave exploring, but the rest are all checked off. All right, so topic of religion in a globalizing world. First thing to understand is that there is a global resurgence of religion in the world. With that, we are also seeing a resurgence of books and articles on religion. I will use the titles of some publications to get at the changing ideas here. There was a 2005 book entitled The Global Resurgence of Religion and the Transformation of International Relations, which sort of gets at my topic today. But as recently as 1999, The Economist magazine published a mock obituary of God. And then in 2002, an author by the name of Steve Bruce published a book that asserted that God is dead. And so he was echoing a statement that had been made by Friedrich Nietzsche a century before. But recent publications suggest that rumors of God's death were premature. One book's title proclaims, "God is back." Another is subtitled, "Return from Exile." So the idea here is that God is returning from exile from the margins of politics to which God had been cast way back in 1648, starting with the Peace of Westphalia, trying to get religion out of politics. An article in the Foreign Policy Journal agrees that God has made a comeback, but it goes a step farther and says actually that God is winning, that religion is advancing to the political sphere where people are choosing the sacred over the secular, and prophetic politics is increasingly important, both domestically and internationally. Yet another publication asserts that the 21st century is God's century, that God's partisans are marching on the world stage, they are gaining political capacity, setting political agendas, and they are here to stay. All right, so with this introduction, I want to underscore 3 points. First of all, in recent years, there has been an upsurge, a resurgence, or the word most often used in the literature is explosion of religion and religious belief in the world. And this includes religious ideas and religious movements. A second one is, it's not just that religion is growing in terms of belief and attendance at prayer services and so on, but that is growing in terms of salience, persuasiveness, influence, and political power. So again, it suggests that it's having an impact in domestic politics and in world politics. It is now providing an alternative in many countries to secular ideologies. And in addition, it is a key source of identity for many people. And this, you might almost call this the era of identity politics. It's very, very important. It's having a political impact within states where we see that religious actors, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, are challenging secular leaders and trying to determine whose values actually get inscribed into public policy. It is also having a political impact between states and among states, and it's posing lots of challenges, including it's challenging our perception of the modern world. Religion was not supposed to be on the world stage at this point. We should also say that religion can affect ideas, norms, values, and events on the world stage, and of course is also affected by these. And the third introductory point is, all this has come as a great surprise, especially to those of us in the West. This was not supposed to happen. Religion was being pushed to the margins of politics and the public sphere, and it was expected that with further modernization, there would be further secularization, and that meant that religion was going to stay in its proper place, basically in places of worship and in the home. Not out in the street where it might scare the horses. So, as all this God talk suggests, religious faith is, as I said, exploding around the world, and it's driven by a couple of things. Okay, so this goes to your trivia question number 5. What contributes to the growth of a major religion? Well, the main things here, fertility rates are very important, and the average age of adherents are very important. And this helps to explain why the fastest growing religion in the world is Islam. The adherents tend to be younger. They tend to have higher fertility rates. Okay, so demographics is very important. Another important thing is conversions. And here's where we come to the fact that the two religions that are growing fastest are both proselytizing religions, Islam and Christianity. And within Christianity, it's especially evangelical Protestantism, or more specifically, Pentecostalism, that is growing rapidly. Where is this happening? In lots of different regions of the world. It's happening in Asia, especially East Asia, Southeast Asia. It's happening in Africa, where Christianity is growing rapidly, and in the next couple of decades, perhaps 4 out of 10 Africans will be Christian. It's happening just about in every part of the world except for Western Europe, and then among a small slice of the global population, the secular elite or the intelligentsia. They're still pretty much firmly set against religion. It's also happening in countries with different political systems, whether they are communist or post-communist, China, Russia. It's happening in places like Turkey. You don't have to go back too far in Turkey's history to the point where the current president, Erdogan, 1997, he was actually arrested for reciting a poem in public which had themes in it of Islam and nationalism. He was arrested and jailed for that. And now, of course, he's bringing Islam back into the public sphere, where really Ataturk had knocked it out back in the 1920s. It's happening in countries with different religious traditions, and religion also is growing in rich countries as well as poor countries. All right, now I'm going to discuss some megatrends in international relations, and I'm sure probably a lot of you are familiar with these, but it sort of sets the context for how religion fits in here. And I'm going to name 5 megatrends. One clearly is that there are power shifts going on in the world. We have gone from the tidy bipolar era of the Cold War, when we had the United States and its allies on the one hand, and we knew who our allies were and we knew who our enemies were. And then we had the Soviet Union and its allies on the other. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had the so-called unipolar moment when the United States was the top dog with no other countries close by. But now we're seeing the rise of the rest, the emerging economies, the 2 Asian giants of China and India, the so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And so power is becoming much more diffuse. So that is one of the big trends. Another is that we're seeing a combination of globalization on the one hand and fragmentation on the other. We're seeing that the world is both coming together and being torn apart. So globalization, of course, is all those processes that have to do with bringing people together, increasing interconnectedness. It's not new, but it's speeding up. It's becoming much faster and wider and deeper. Part of that, some people also see that there is a trend towards more global governance. Not global government, but governance for a world without government. So there's still no authoritative executive power, legislative power, or judicial power, but we do have a lot more international laws, institutions, principles, norms, and all these things that foster day-to-day cooperation, that enable mail to get around the world, for planes to land safely, and so on. A lot more shared understandings about how states are to behave. At the same time, we're seeing fragmentation. We're seeing, at the global level, this division into regional blocs, whether it's the European Union or Mercosur or the African Union, the rise of regional trade blocs especially. And we're seeing resurgent nationalism. And this is tearing apart states often. This was one of the many elements that led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but also certainly Yugoslavia, resurgent nationalism. And there's sort of a dialectical relationship between these two, because there are some parts of the world, especially the non-Western world, where they see globalization as a homogenizing, westernizing, even Americanizing force. And they don't want that. They want to hold on to their local identities. And so you have, it's sometimes called glocalization, that you have globalization and then you have people at the local level saying, I want to hold on to our local identity. There's a book that kind of captured this idea. And this was by Thomas Friedman. He's a New York Times columnist. And he wrote this book 20 years ago, The Lexus and the Olive Tree. And he said the Lexus essentially, that represented things that people wanted, like economic development and prosperity, right? We all want that regardless of where we are. But we also want to stay rooted. We want to hold on to our traditions. We want to hold on to our identities. And that's symbolized by the olive tree, things that root us. Okay, so we see both of these things going on. Some people also call this fragmentation, integration and fragmentation. Okay, a third trend is democratization. It's been said that we live in an era of democracy. However, certainly, as Bill can say better than I can, that unfortunately is not the last word. In fact, Freedom House, their 2018 report, says that democracy is now in crisis, and in particular that we are seeing assaults on freedoms and on democratic values. And they list the United States among the countries where democracy is in crisis and there are assaults on such things. There is a religious element with regard to democratization. In 1974 in the Iberian Peninsula, that's when the so-called third wave of democratization began. And those are Catholic countries, and it leapt over to Latin America, their former colonies, which also were predominantly Catholic. And these countries, one by one, it was a surprise at the time that these entrenched authoritarian regimes fell fairly rapidly to democracy. And so Samuel Huntington says that especially changes in the Roman Catholic Church contributed to this wave of democratization. So he says that this third wave was a Catholic wave. Okay, a fourth megatrend is that we're seeing a proliferation of actors on the world stage. This includes, as states are breaking down, the number of states is increasing slowly, the addition of countries such as South Sudan. And traditionally, of course, international relations has referred to relations among states. States have been seen as the actors on the world stage. However, we are seeing a rise not just in the number of states, but in IGOs and NGOs. So in intergovernmental organizations, these are organizations whose members are sovereign states, and non-governmental organizations. So these are intersocietal or transnational organizations. And these things are facilitated by social media, for instance. Finally, we're seeing a shift in the nature of large-scale political violence. We are going from an era of interstate war to an era of intrastate war. That's becoming much more prevalent. These intrastate wars, some sort of civil war, of course, often have an international element. Look at the Syrian civil war, for instance, right? The involvement of the United States and Russia and other outside actors. So it's a civil war that's been internationalized. And of course, also, it's been drawing fighters from around the world. So there's also that transnational element. Okay, so I'm going to then look at a couple of these megatrends and bring religion in. And in particular, changes in large-scale conflict, and then the nature and role of transnational religion. So previously, as I said before, large-scale conflicts it was interstate warfare. Certainly think of the world wars. And the main fault line in the world, at least during the Cold War, was ideological. It was the East-West fault line. But now we're seeing that conflict is taking on new patterns. And it's not only a shift to intrastate conflict, but also communal wars. And so this is sometimes one state against a group within the state, or sometimes groups within a state are at odds with one another. And part of this, the religion comes in because ethnicity and religion are often wrapped up with the identities that unite the competing groups. Okay, religion is often very much a part of the identities that unite people and get them to be in conflict with one another. So if you look at during the Cold War, these subnational identities were suppressed in places like the former Soviet Union and former Yugoslavia. Okay, Tito talked about brotherhood and unity, and he wouldn't let anybody talk about being a Serb or a Croat or a Bosnian. You were a Yugoslav. And what we see then is that these subnational identities were suppressed, but pressures built up. And it was these subnational identities that helped to tear these states apart. Okay, so in the context then of these various megatrends, we're seeing that religions and religious ideas are bumping up against each other and causing conflicts that sometimes turn violent. Now I'm going to look at two different takes on the nature of this new warfare that we're seeing. And these are both contested takes on the world, I will say. One is the idea of new wars, and the other is the clash of civilizations. You might be familiar with this idea of clash of civilizations. It came out with Samuel Huntington's article in 1993. And essentially what he said is that civilizations are the broadest cultural entities and the broadest and increasingly important level of a person's identification. So we might identify as Iowans, as Americans, but then what Huntington is saying, our broadest level of identification is Western civilization, that we identify as part of this civilization. And so he divides the world up into 7 or 8 different civilizations, and almost all of these are defined by religion. Okay, so you have the Western civilization, which really, he says, is Christian civilization. You have Confucian civilization, Hindu civilization, Slavic Orthodox, Islam. And he especially singles out Islamic civilization for being the real problem for the West. He sees a big clash between Western civilization and Islamic civilization. And he's been widely criticized for especially his comment that Islam has bloody borders, that around the sort of arc of Islam, especially in North Africa and the Middle East, that all around there, they're in conflict with other civilizations. Okay, so he's saying that now in this post-Cold War age, civilizational differences are the fundamental source of conflict. Not ideology, not territory, doesn't talk so much about power. It's really civilizations. And religions are at the heart of each of those. So the fault line wars now occur where civilizations meet, these sort of borderlands. So again, writing in the early 1990s, when Yugoslavia was starting to unravel, he counted the wars in Yugoslavia, especially in Bosnia, as among the fault line wars. And he fingered religion as the main source of conflict there. Now, I would say that's a debatable argument, but that's one of the things he was arguing. And there is, some credibility to this. If you look at the main conflicts, they were largely along religious and ethnic lines. You had the Catholic Croats. You had the Muslim Bosnians. You had the Orthodox Serbs. But they were really all South Slavs. So the ethnic identity difference was a little bit trumped up, as was the religious difference. A lot of this had to do with actually elite manipulation of religion. But going on with Huntington, he says that civilizations will clash for a number of reasons, a central one being real and basic differences, especially religious differences. And I suggested, again, as I suggested, he especially anticipated a clash between the so-called Christian West, Europe and North America, and Islam. And it was a bloc at that time of about 4 dozen Muslim majority countries, and said that with the collapse of the Soviet Union and international communism, they were no longer the main threat to the West. Now Islam was. All right, so that's one much debated argument. Another you're probably less familiar with, and this comes from Mary Kaldor, and it's the idea of new wars. So what she says is that conflict on the world stage has shifted from so-called old wars to new wars. And new wars are different because they have different actors, different goals, different methods, different forms of finance. So as I indicated before, with the shift to intrastate war, one or more of the actors is not a state. They don't have a professional army. They're not a sovereign state. It could be a group against a state, a group that's challenging a state from within, or it could be 2 different groups within a state that are at odds. So these groups could be militias, jihadists, warlords, criminal gangs, mercenaries. Think, for instance, of Boko Haram in Nigeria, the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, and so on. Their methods are different too. Okay, guerrilla warfare, ethnic cleansing, genocide, spreading fear and hatred. In new wars, too, she says, civilians are not simply, and this is an ugly term, collateral damage. Civilians are in the crosshairs. Civilians are targeted in these wars. And we find that a lot more civilians are, in fact, killed in these new wars. And often it involves some kind of forced displacement of a population, whether it's internal displacement or waves of emigration. So think again of the Syrian civil war, Rwanda, former Yugoslavia. So I said also the forms of finance are different. It's not being paid for by taxpayers. It might be natural resources, oil or diamonds. It can be looting, extortion, kidnapping for ransom, illicit trade, such as trade in antiquities. And the goals are different. Mary Calder says, quote, "New wars are fought in the name of identity, ethnic, religious, or tribal. They're not ideological goals, and they're not trying to capture territory." So this is identity politics. Groups that closely identify on whatever basis, but again, religion and ethnicity are usually very much a part of this. They're seeking recognition, rights, representation, power, greater autonomy for their group. Okay, it's not doing something in the name of the public good. It's doing something in the name of their group's good. And often the identities at the heart of these groups, they're exclusive. Okay, you can't join. You are a member, you aren't a member. Could be a matter of blood. And we see also that new wars often manifest as a very divisive form of nationalism. Again, driven by collective identity. Ethnic identity and religious identity especially. New wars are often also differ with regard to geography. Most of these are occurring in the global south, not in the global north, so more in the developing world. And finally, new wars are wars of the era of globalization. New forms of telecommunications help to link local conflicts into global conflicts. You might, for instance, connect into diaspora communities or transnational organized crime. Weapons may come from a global arms market. Okay, so a bottom line here is that these two main ideas of the change in the nature of warfare, religion looms large in both of them. All right, now I move on to the idea of transnational religion. So transnational, we're talking here simply about things that transcend or move across states' borders. People, goods, ideas, information, services, norms, cultures, beliefs, religious movements, all these kinds of things. And these are clearly related to some of the megatrends, globalization in particular, and the proliferation of actors on the world stage. So globalization facilitates the growth of transnational networks. Again, think of how communications and transportation have made it a lot easier for people to cross borders. Think of all the people from around the world who heeded Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's call to join the Islamic State and to fight. And they were able to hear that call and to get there because of modern technologies, essentially. Religious actors are rising among the number of transnational actors. And so you have these networks, these groups that communicate, share ideas, foster communities of believers, and sometimes also they have some kind of political element that they're working on as well. Okay, so some examples of transnational religious phenomena that influence international relations: religiously motivated terrorism, fundamentalist movements that have been sparked by modernization, and then international norms that have been influenced by religious norms, whether it's in the realm of human rights or the laws of war and so on. Well, political scientists have come up with some really nifty little shorthands for these religious transnational actors. One is RTAs, religious transnational actors. And the other is RINGOs, religious non-governmental organizations. Okay, so either one, they're religious actors that operate transnationally. So they connect with like-minded individuals and groups in different countries. They exchange ideas, perhaps they engage in collective actions. And secular organizations are growing in terms of their transnational operations. Same is true of religious organizations. And again, this is very much encouraged and facilitated by the deepening and widening of globalization. Think, for instance, of how modern technology helped the people during the Arab Spring communicate with one another. When the governments were blocking a lot of means of communication, people could get on social media and say, meet in Tahrir Square at noon on Friday, right? They could get around the government. So the ease of communications, but of course, sometimes this has a downside. Think, for instance, of back in 2005, when a Danish publication depicted Muhammad, and the eyes of many Muslims dishonored him. And this elicited very sharp protests and violence in some cases, sharp protests from Muslim governments, sharp protests from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and others. And then there's also, missionary activity that also contributes to this transnational activity. Again, the two great monotheistic and universalizing and proselytizing religions are Christianity and Islam. Both engage in missionary activity and foster transnational religious connections. And this missionary activity is one of the reasons that these two religions are the largest and that they are growing the fastest, with Islam growing faster than Christianity. So, I will talk briefly about a couple of these transnational organizations. One is the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, it's a transnational entity with centralized control. It's been called a transnational religious regime. It's got a transnational program, including all of its missionary work and concerns about global conditions, whether it's peace, justice, human rights, human development, and so on. Of course, the Roman Catholic Church is unique among religions and among actors on the world stage in lots of ways. One thing is its membership. About 16% of the world's population is Catholic. There are more than 1 billion people in this transnational religious community. A second thing is that it has a centralized religious hierarchy. A centralized religious hierarchy. No other religion has that. And there's Rome that can tell you whether or not things are okay, whether or not you're on the right path, and other religions don't have that. It has its own territory. It's considered a state. It has diplomatic relations with almost all the world's states. It's a microstate, of course. It's only got about 1,000 people in it, and it's smaller than the mall in Washington, D.C. But it is a religious entity operating in the world of sovereign states. And it's not a member of the United Nations, but it is an observer as a non-member state. And it has observer status at a lot of other intergovernmental organizations as well. Its leader, the Pope, has the status of juridical personality in international affairs, which gives him certain legal rights as well as obligations. And perhaps more importantly, he is a global bully pulpit. What other religious leader so often makes the front page of the New York Times? Right? Even non-Catholics listen to the Pope. He's considered a moral voice for many. Okay. And in addition, it also has its own transnational communications network, including an extensive radio service, And of course, as I've just mentioned, it receives very wide coverage, especially in the Western media. Now I'm going to turn to a different organization, a very different organization. And this is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC. And this is an intergovernmental organization. It's an IGO. So it was founded back in 1969. It has as members 57 states. They are all Muslim majority states, and many of them have Islam established as the state religion. It is clearly, though, Islam that holds together the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And some of the goals behind the OIC are to be a collective voice for Muslims around the world, to get Muslims to act together in solidarity, to put the concerns of Muslims on the agenda of the global community, to improve the collective position of Muslims in world politics, to try to have greater integration among these Muslim states, and also to protect Islam's image and to try to roll back the tendency to Islamophobia. A recent time in which we see the OIC's response or lack of response was January 2017. And this was when President Donald Trump issued an executive order that temporarily banned entry to the United States from 7 countries, all of which were Muslim countries. Although he said this was not a Muslim ban, they all had large Muslim majorities. And we note that leaders of major Muslim countries that did not make the list, such as Saudi Arabia, were conspicuously silent on this issue. And so, although the OIC is supposed to be promoting solidarity, there are some breaks here. But the OIC ultimately did find its voice, and it expressed grave concern about the travel ban. And it also said, quote, "Such selective and discriminatory acts will only serve to embolden the radical narratives of extremists." All right, I'm going to quickly go over some of the factors that hinder the OIC's ability to create a pan-Islamic identity and the unity that it says to be seeking. One is that it's really hard to cooperate when your members are engaged in power struggles. And especially in the Middle East. We've got Iran and Saudi Arabia. They both want to be the top dog in the area. Iran, because of its revolution. Saudi Arabia is the home of Mecca and Medina. And also part of this is the Sunni-Shia divide, which has become quite politicized, right? And it's also one of those fault lines. This is one of the critiques against the clash of civilizations, is how do you explain the fighting between Shia and Sunni? Presumably, they're in the same civilization, right? A second factor to note here is that while they're trying to enhance solidarity, they have competing national interests. And as states, they tend to put those interests ahead of the collective interests. And a third thing is that it sort of operates on the basis of conflicting models. One is the idea, the Muslim model, we might call it, and that is the idea of the Ummah, the transnational Muslim community that is not geographically bound. It's not a state. It is transnational. It's simply, it has no fixed boundaries. They're operating on that basis, and they're also operating on the basis of the nation-state model, right? That you have these nation-states, they come together, they form organizations, they interact with other states. So there's a little bit of tug here. But that is one of the important ringos on the world stage. So we might also talk about Islamism as a transnational movement. But I will instead turn to wrapping up here as to why some of these items are important. Okay, so one is that globalization and transnationalism affect religion and religious transnational associations, but the reverse is true as well. So religion and these transnational organizations also affect globalization. Neither globalization or transnationalism is new, but in recent decades, they've progressed rapidly. Second is that these transnational linkages can and do sometimes affect world politics. These can be major channels through which religious organizations influence the transnational system, or excuse me, the international system. And I've mentioned the Roman Catholic Church and the Organization of American States and Islamism. The Muslim Brotherhood is another. World Vision, World Council of Churches, the World Hindu Council. These are all transnational religious associations. As one author said, quote, transnational interactions, mobilizations, activities, campaigns, power relations, and so on influence the policies of international actions, the nation state being the prime one. Okay, a third point here then is that militant religious movements can contribute to 5 different kinds of transnational activities: migration, irredentism, diasporas, succession, and terrorism. Okay, think about migration and think about how the Islamic State, especially its operations in Syria, have affected migration. It's certainly the outflow, the internal displacement, but also the outflow from that region, and then also the people who are going there to join the movement. Well, not so much anymore. Its heyday seems to be over. We also see that there is religion-based irredentism. And here the idea is to reclaim lands that have been lost, especially ones that have been lost to non-Muslim forces or influences. Diasporas are created simply when members of a particular religious community are dispersed. So, for instance, I know a lot of Sudanese refugees are relocated to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and so they make up a Sudanese diaspora. Succession, terrorism, I won't go into those right now. But my fourth point is that these RTAs or these Ringos are very active in the preeminent global forum, the United Nations. And the United Nations, of course, is the most inclusive of all the intergovernmental organizations. Almost all sovereign states have joined the United Nations. Now, this isn't a validly secular entity, but nonetheless, it works with religious actors on a variety of issues, including international development and global climate change, things that you might not immediately associate with religious interests. And finally, in some places, transnational religious organizations or religiously motivated organizations pose challenges to secular states. So we see then that there is this global resurgence of religion on the world stage, that religion is expanding in most parts of the world, in most religions, with Christianity and Islam being the largest, growing the fastest. And this is not just a religious matter. This is a matter that is important for international relations, and it's important for policymakers and informed citizens to understand the role of religion in the world today. Thank you.
Does Huntington view Bosnians, Uyghurs, Indonesians, Saudis, and Iranians as having a common civilization?
Okay, so I presume that has to do with the idea of there being an Islamic civilization. As I think that is implied in the question, it would be hard to make that argument. I don't remember him talking about Uyghurs at all, but there has been an entire industry of books and articles in response to Huntington's Class of Civilizations thesis. So it's very influential, and it's been torn apart in a number of ways, including the idea that, how can you suggest that all Muslims, wherever they are, whatever their circumstances, are part of one common civilization? It's a tough argument to support.
So the next question is really broad, but it asks you to tell us more about why you think we see this resurgence of religion in the world today compared to, I guess, 20-some years ago.
That's a great question. In some parts of the world, especially the non-Western world, it's the idea that there's been this whole idea of modernization, which really in other parts of the world is also often taken as westernization. And part of this modernization is industrialization. It's also secularization. And some simply don't want to secularize. They believe that their religious faith is important to politics, that it shouldn't be on the sidelines, that it shouldn't be restricted to home and hearth, that religious values should be inscribed into public law. And especially we see in former colonial areas, they tried a lot of the Western ideologies, right? They tried socialism, they tried capitalism, they tried, you name it, and they've failed. They've just failed in a lot of places. And so as an alternative to failed secular ideologies, and this is one of the things that has given rise to Islamism in particular. So political Islam, sometimes called Islamic fundamentalism, is look at the countries that were colonized, where they tried to create this secular model and impose these secular ideologies. And what's happened to these countries? They haven't succeeded as they thought they should have. They've come up with corrupt autocratic regimes which aren't benefiting a lot of the people. So these secular ideologies that are part of this modernization and westernization package, they haven't worked for us. And so one response, and especially, again, we see this in Islamism, is the problem is we need to go back and be better Muslims. The problem is we've gotten too far away from religion. So that's one of the explanations. Some of the others, it's missionary activity, which, as with some other things in transnational religion, is facilitated by global telecommunications and the ease of travel. You can get your message out to anyone. You don't even have to be there in person. So those things, as well as, so that helps with conversions, but demographics also, as I said, especially among Muslims, young populations, and high fertility rates. And so even without conversions, Islam continues to grow apace.
All right, well, I'll ask a question to follow up on that, I guess. And can you talk more about the divisions within Islam, besides the Sunni Shia division, that pertain to which where we see religion growing fastest, which are fueling militancy, any of the other things? Because it seems to me that Islam is so broad that it's got to have those kind of internal divisions that matter.
It is a proselytizing faith, and the projections suggest that whereas some religions are losing adherents, people aren't very likely to convert out of Islam. They may go, some may go from religion into the unaffiliated column, but that doesn't seem to be so much an issue for Muslims, for the Muslim faith, as for others. I'm not sure that got all your question?
That's fine.
No. What was the other part?
Just divisions within Islam that seem to be playing a bigger role.
Oh, yeah, divisions within Islam. Okay, so the major division, of course, is between Sunni and Shia. Sunnis consider themselves the Orthodox version. They are about 90% of Muslims. there are Shia, I know, a little less than 10%, and then there are smaller versions, and there are variations within this. So in Saudi Arabia, for instance, it's Sunni, but it's Wahhabism. It's a very particular kind of Islam. Oh, I should, just came to mind. One of the things that might discourage people from converting away from Islam in some countries in which Islam is the state religion is that you can be jailed or killed in some countries for doing that. Saudi Arabia, it does not allow in other religions, period. So there are some countries where you have to be Muslim. And proselytizing or apostasy or blasphemy, these are serious offenses. And again, in some cases, you may pay with your life. So that might be, I'm not saying in general, but in these authoritarian regimes in which Islam is the state religion, they don't lose too many faithful.
All right, well, we've come to the end of our talk, so let's thank Professor Lynda Barrow again for her remarks on religion in a resurgent world. I want to thank our sponsors, University of Iowa International Programs, University of Iowa's Honors Program, the Public Policy Center, and the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization. And today's special sponsors, I have lost my little script. So Mike Margolin and Texas Plus and Conrad Schultz. Okay, thank you very much. Let me say, Lynda, we're very grateful for you speaking today with us, and we have a present for you, and it is what we like to call the coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug.
Excellent, thank you. That's great, thank you very much.
All right, thank you everyone for attending today. It was great to see you, and we are adjourned.